Hi, sixth grade. We're getting back to some normal lessons. I have recorded your notes here. You can pause the video whenever you need to. Today has quite a few notes, so take your time. The assignment shouldn't take too long. So just pause the video and copy down the writing in red. Bad news is that there is a lot of writing in red. So we are converting decimals, fractions, and percentages. So those three things are going to be converted back and forth. Here are our goals. Again, don't be afraid to pause the video, and you can certainly shorten these notes. So goal 1, understand that a percentage is a special fraction that is always out of 100. Goal 2, understand that a fraction is a division problem, and I try to say that a lot throughout the year. And goal number 3 is, of course, to be able to complete the assignment by converting decimals, fractions, and percentages to other forms. And those other forms are just themselves. Those three are the only three things that we are dealing with. So there are 6 different conversions that we're going to learn today. Some of them are very easy, and some of them are a little more complicated. We're going to start with a fairly simple one, converting a decimal to a fraction. So if you are given a decimal, all you have to do in order to convert it to a fraction is to read it aloud. So if we have, let's say, a number like this, instead of reading it like 0.77, like we do a lot of times just to make things easier, we're going to need to read it with proper place value. So we would read this number as 77 hundredths, because this is the tenths, this is the hundredths. So 77 hundredths, well, that fraction would just be 77 hundredths, and we would not need to simplify that. Another example would be if we have, let's say, this. Well, this would be in the tenths, so this would be 4 tenths. So our fraction would be 4 tenths, and we can simplify that to 2 fifths. Notice that I'm writing these notes in black, because if you were watching the video, you might already know how to do some of these, and you don't need to write down the notes. One last one, just to make it simple. So we have a decimal like this. Well, this is 1 and 1/10. So we would just write 1 and 1/10. So to convert decimals to fractions, you just need to read the decimal aloud. Step 2, decimals to percent. We need to multiply by 100 and add a percentage sign. So the important thing to realize is, as a decimal, if we have the number 1, that represents 1 whole, and that is equal to 100%. Which is why in baseball, the batting averages are technically decimals, and if you are batting 1,000, that's written as 1.000, even though that doesn't last for very long, if ever. So if we have a decimal, let's go with 73 hundredths. To get that to a percentage, we need to multiply by 100. And what you can do is you can move the decimal point 2 spots to the right. So if I have this again, if I move the decimal point 2 spots to the right, then I will have my percentage. And I just need to add a percentage sign. That can work like this. If we have 0.7, which is 7/10, right, we can move the decimal point 2 spots to the right. So there's one, there's another, and this gap is going to have to be filled with a 0. So that will equal 70%. Oh, we're running out of room. Let's say we have let's go. All right, we're switched to blue for some reason. So if we have something like this, we're going to move the decimal point over twice, and then we have 23.5%. So you can multiply by 100, but the easiest way to do that is to just move the decimal point 2 spots to the right. Okay, fractions to a decimal. This is the toughest one. So if we have a fraction, let's say 4/5, what we're going to need to do is divide the numerator by the denominator. And the examples on your assignment are going to be pretty simple, but it is still can be a little complicated. So we are going to do 4 divided by 5. And that's going to look like this. If we're doing long division, I'm going to actually give ourselves a little more room. And this can be tricky for those of you who have never done this before. So we are going to set this up, and we're going to actually make this 4.0 because we're going to have it as a decimal. So in long division, the decimal point, they are going to be straight on top of each other. So we can see that 5 goes into 4 0 times, but now 5 goes into 40 8 times. And 8 times 5 is 40, and that is our perfect decimal. I'm going to show a different one. We can show, well, let's go 3 divided by 4. So if we have the fraction 3/4, we do 3 divided by 4. Luckily, some of you can do using your head, but if I'm showing the long division, I'm going to set this up and make it 3.0. Decimal point goes straight above. I know 4 goes into 3 0 times. 4 goes into 30 7 times. So I'm going to subtract. But, we got to keep adding on. So instead of having a remainder, we're going to keep adding zeros until we can have a clean decimal. And none of your decimals will go on forever today. So now we can bring down the 0. We can see that 4 goes into 20 5 times. And now we have no remainder. So 3/4 converts to 0.75 or 75 hundredths. So converting a fraction to a decimal is definitely the most difficult piece. Okay, taking a fraction to a percentage. So again, you're converting it to a decimal. There's not a great consistent way to do this other than to convert it to a decimal. But once you have it as a decimal, you are going to multiply by 100, which luckily we already know how to do, right? We know how to convert a decimal to a percent. So now we're just going to take the fraction, make it a decimal, and then multiply by 100. So if we have, let's say, 4/5, again, we're going to convert that to a decimal by dividing, which will give us 8/10. And then we're going to multiply that by 100. So multiply that by 100. You can move the decimal point over twice. That will give you 80%. If we had one like, trying to think, let's go 13/20, we would use long division. We know 20 goes into 13 0 times. 20 goes into 130 6 times. 20 goes into 100 5 times. So our decimal would be 65 hundredths. Multiply that by 100 times 100, and we get 65%. So starting with a fraction is definitely the most difficult. Okay, taking a percentage and converting it to a decimal, we're going to do the opposite of a decimal to percent, and we're going to divide by 100. So if I have 73%, I'm going to divide by 100. We're going to need to imagine our decimal point being here, because we can think of that as 73.0 if we want. And the decimal point is going to move 2 to the left, which will equal 0.73. If you want to add the 0 there, you can. So if we have 45%, going to divide by 100, that will leave us with 45 hundredths. If you have a percentage larger than 100%, if you have 130%, you're still going to divide that by 100. But the decimal point's only going to move 2 spots. So it's going to go 1, 2. We'll end up with that as a decimal. And this 0 is optional. You would not need to write that. Last one, percentage to a fraction. All you're going to need to do is understand that a percentage is always out of 100. So if we have 72%, that just means it's 72 out of 100. So we always set it over 100. And we can simplify that. We can divide both of those by 4. Let's get 18/25. If we have 60%, that means you have a 60/100. We can simplify that to 3/5. If we have 97%, that means you got a 97 out of 100. And that cannot simplify. So I know this was a lot of information. I'm hoping that most of the steps were very simple and you can focus on the fractions to percentages and fractions to decimals, because those are the two toughest. The other thing I want you to realize for this assignment is you don't need to use all 6 of these things, because if you have a percentage, you can turn that into a fraction, or you can turn that into a decimal. Because once you have a decimal or a fraction, then you can convert that to other things. Hop on Google Meets if you need help during your class period, and good luck.